Hi, this is Bram Cohen's podcast where we go in depth about all kinds of crazy topics. I'd like to preface this by apologizing for the sound quality. This was recorded a while ago. Simon did a great interview. We wanted to get it out there. Future episodes will have better recording.
Yeah, so Simon has had this remarkable, amazing success recently with his YouTube channel, Cracking the Cryptic, where they solve Sudokus. That's the channel, and they do walkthroughs and explanations of them. I myself have become a big fan of this channel and have been following it, partially because actually I'm not a very good Sudoku solver, so it's really great to see the secrets unlocked of all these amazing puzzles, which I probably would have failed to get through had I just been doing it on my own. But I can really appreciate the logic involved in them. They now have over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, so the lockdown has been doing very well for them. And I actually, having watched this, got a bit interested in setting some Sudokus and have had 2 of them featured on the channel. So Simon, we've never actually spoken before.
No, thanks for having me on. This is my first podcast, so I hope I'm interesting enough for you.
Yeah, so I'm always curious, like what you're looking for in Sudokus that you cover, and like what's the theory here?
Well, we have a bank of testers who basically select puzzles that might be suitable for the channel now. And the remit we give them is that the most important thing about the puzzle is that it's interesting. So we don't tell them it's got to be monstrously hard at all. And in fact, in some ways, I think it would be nice if the puzzles were, on average, just a little bit easier than they've been becoming. But it's crucial that they have something about them that's elegant. And as you found watching the channel, Bram, there's something incredibly, gratifying about seeing the logic that gets hidden into these puzzles. And I think it's often something that people who only have the experience of doing Sudoku in a newspaper maybe, or on the New York Times website or something like that, they probably don't realize the world that exists beyond those sort of computer-generated puzzles. And I think once you get bitten by it, it's incredibly addictive.
Yeah, you can't look at a Sudoku and say, oh, that was human-generated or computer-generated. That there's some indicators in terms of the types of rules used if you're used to it, but you kind of have to actually walk through the logic to really appreciate these things.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost like, reading a good book or something. You can look at the cover, but you don't really know what's in it until you start to experience it. And a Sudoku, when you first glance at it, could be good, it could be bad. And it's only once you actually try to solve it, you suddenly realize, good grief, I'm being led on a journey here. And it's then whether you can follow the compiler's train of thought. And sometimes the compiler will lose his train of thought and the puzzle may not be quite as good as you hoped it would be. But so often nowadays, especially with the puzzles that we get to try on the channel, they really are very, very beautiful. I overuse the word masterpieces, but they are. Many of them are masterpieces.
Yeah, the quality of them really has gone up, along with the hardness, actually, as well.
I couldn't agree more, yeah. Well, as you can imagine, as we've grown, we get more and more submissions to the point where, we get double-digit numbers a day of puzzles being sent to us, often by the world's best constructors. So although we do get puzzles from new compilers, we might be getting puzzles from somebody who's been on the channel 10 times before. And then you're trying to filter those down into, what should be that day's puzzle. Now, obviously, there's also a sort of batch of puzzles where Mark and I failed to solve them. That's the worst kind, because those puzzles, they've been blessed as good enough by the testers. And then the only reason they don't appear is because we haven't been clever enough to solve them, or, there's been enormous pauses in the video while we've just sat there thinking for 25 minutes doing nothing, and those puzzles never actually get to be made into videos. And I felt quite bad about some of those over the last couple of years.
Yeah, you've had videos where you spend the first 15 minutes of the video just fumbling. So I think if you have one where you spent an excessively long time at the beginning just going, I don't know where to start, I would much rather you edit that video just by cutting out a section of you being lost, but keeping all the parts where you actually figured it out. I think that would still be a compelling video.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think people now, they expect it to be, perfect. And, if we were to have loads of cuts in the video, they would just think, oh, you went off and used a solver or something. So we try to not do that. And that does mean that some of the videos get canned because I deem them to be too dull.
Yeah, so from the point of view of someone who's been doing some amount of setting, I actually have an extensive background in puzzles. I invent mechanical puzzles, and I have several in mass production for that. But I guess partially because I haven't been picking up puzzles. There have been no meetups or anything, so I haven't been dealing with mechanical puzzles, which has been part of why I've been nudged in the direction of doing Sudokus this last year. But, your fan Discord, even if you just took the puzzles that were rated excellent by the internal reviews in the fan Discord, that's more puzzles than I could ever get through. Maybe there's some solvers who could literally solve all of those, but even just taking the ones that were rated excellent from there would be a real stretch to humanly one person get through all of them. Yeah, and people have given some hints there about your review process on everything. And the thing that seems really unfortunate is when puzzles are submitted, there's this pretty extensive process where people go about solving them and stuff, but then there's no feedback to the setters. It's even if you hated it, I'd really like to hear, if you went through all the work of getting an opinion, I'd really like to get, whatever feedback happens from that.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one because basically the testers that we've got at the moment are completely inundated, because we get so many puzzles in, they spend an awful lot of their time doing this, which they do because they love the channel. And I know this I've had some experience in running a subscription crossword magazine. If we were to open those testers up and say, well, now not only do you have to, solve the puzzle and see whether it's good enough, but you've also got to enter into a dialogue with the setters about why their puzzle was or wasn't good enough. You can imagine, that's not an insignificant amount of work in addition to just solving the puzzle. And, then maybe there'll come a point when we have an enormous bank of testers and, we reach a kind of equilibrium where, it's not unreasonable to ask them to at least give a little bit of feedback. But at the moment, we've not done it. And, I say mostly that's because of time and I don't want to take any more of their time. But it's also that some setters are incredibly protective about their puzzles.
Yeah.
You can imagine, if somebody selects or doesn't select an arrow Sudoku for the channel, and then the setter who's rejected might go through the arrow Sudoku that was selected and say, well, that's slightly worse, I think, for this, and this reason. And then, you can end up with bad will and all sorts of things. So we've just shied away from it.
Yeah, I've been treating setting Sudokus like I treat inventing mechanical puzzles. So mechanical puzzles, there's this tremendous hurdle to get over. It's just really, really hard to make them. I think Sudokus, it's relatively easy because all you need is a pen and paper, literally, and you can get going making them. And if someone wants to know what are the current trends in Sudoku, they can just watch a bunch of videos on your channel and get a pretty good idea of what's going on. Where mechanical puzzles, even the effort involved in figuring out how to CAD things and make them and the feedback loop and the skills involved are a huge, huge hurdle to get over. But because I've been approaching Sudokus the same way, it takes me days to make one of them. It's so much work for these.
I'm not actually surprised by that. We're releasing the first video on the channel by Jovial, who's you might have heard of as a setter. He set an arrow Sudoku recently on a channel called Syzygy, which was an amazing puzzle. And he's made a video about how he set the puzzle. And that's going out, I think, on Sunday. And in that video, he says it took him 90 hours to create one puzzle, which is, it's a staggering amount of work.
Yeah, that's not very out of line.
Yeah. I mean, you understand why people would view their puzzles as almost like their children. When you invest that much time into the creation of something, it really becomes precious to you, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons the channel's become a little bit popular is that we have this opportunity to show people these beautiful creations And I just don't think people realised they existed before cracking the cryptic, really. I think people at the World Puzzle Championship or the World Sudoku Championship were sort of aware of it, but it was a very niche market. And the great thing about the internet, of course, is that you can make that market reach a lot more people.
Yeah, well, you can see directly how your channel is actually affecting setting, not just from the sheer amount of Sudoku setting that's happening and people directly attributing their getting into it from it, but actually details of how people set and what people are going for. Like, you get really excited when you use coloring in solving a Sudoku, which is, for people listening in, generally correlates with marking these two cells have to have the same value in them, which is an unusual thing to happen in Sudokus and just leads to very, very interesting logic when it comes up, which has directly resulted in setters really, really going out of their way to make that factor into solving as much as possible.
You're so right. And I think I was just commenting to Mark this morning about how many amazing arrow Sudokus there seem to be nowadays. And I think that's our fault a little bit, because we said we were going to make an arrow Sudoku app. And I think that's almost, pushed the setters in that direction a little bit. And one of the issues we're having is that the setters are so clever and so creative, and you all know this because you're one of them, but they're pushing the boundaries all the time, I think, of what's reasonable to ask somebody to solve. I think 2 years ago on the channel, it was relatively unusual for Mark or I to fail to solve a puzzle. Now, it's not common that we'll fail to solve it, but it's becoming much more common. Once a week, I'll fail to solve a puzzle that I'm meant to solve. And, if that trend continues, it will become very worrying.
Yeah, it seems like in terms of your being a black box of feedback, if you could at least give feedback to people when you do fail to solve a puzzle, at least link to it somewhere or something, send mail to the person who said it or something, saying we're so sorry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've toyed with that idea. But then I think there would become a great sort of cachet in terms of, I can imagine all sort of rival channels starting up where they say, we'll do all the puzzles they failed to get or something. And
I don't think that would be a bad thing.
Well, you might not. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, some Sudokus, I've only really set a handful of Sudokus. And some of them are like, well, this is the first one I made, but this other one here is really like a better version of that one because I spend forever on these things. But there are some that I've made that I fear are just way too hard. Like, they're up on Logic Masters Germany and they don't even have a rating because so few people have succeeded in solving them. And I've gotten very, very strong positive feedback about the logic from some of these, but literally it's been like, one of them, people are like, can you give me a hint, right? After I cajoled people into really seriously attacking it, because there's this one that has like really, really novel logic that I love on it, but it's very different from what you're used to. But when I've cajoled people into solving it, they've been like, can you give me a hint, after these very good solvers have spent half an hour just staring at it. And then I'll give them a hint, and then after a while they're like, okay, I solved that. That was great, but it took me 6 hours.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. If you look at Logic Masters Germany is a great example. There are so many puzzles appearing there now, and even very, well-known names are only getting a few solves for some of their puzzles. Yeah, I don't know whether that's because the puzzle itself is monstrously difficult or there's just so many other puzzles to choose from. I noticed one by Totally Normal Cat just the other day. I think it was called Convergence, that only has 4 or 5 solves on Logic Masters Germany, which, it probably indicates it's monstrously hard. But it's a sad day. Puzzles, that are likely to be incredibly high in terms of their quality aren't getting much attention. But I guess that was the world before the sort of explosion in interest in Sudoku.
Yes. Having looked at some of Totally Normal Cat's puzzles, I would imagine it's extremely difficult to solve that one.
Yeah.
I don't know really how to gauge difficulty in making puzzles. One of the first ones I set was a hidden skyscraper Sudoku.
Oh. Yeah.
Okay. You actually solved one of those on the channel by Ahaupt. And the one I had is a rather different take on that same set of rules, but much more difficult. And that's...
Okay. Much more difficult than a puzzle by Ahout, which is a hidden skyscraper. Oh.
Yeah.
It makes me scared.
Yeah. The feedback from the few people who have solved it has been, this is great, but oh man, that was hard.
Yeah. You see, what I think there might be quite interesting is say there was a puzzle like that, which is just really brutally hard. Mm-hmm. And, it might not be suitable for a live solve, but, if it's one of those puzzles that you sort of worry away over a weekend or something, maybe there's a market in, for videos, walkthroughs of the logic. If there's beautiful logic in the puzzle, you could still do videos where you explain just how to go about solving them.
Yeah, for that one, I have myself walked through it and, found all the logic to be explainable. But to do a video, I'd have to put together a script for it and everything. Even that actually would be a lot of work and a lot of steps. For this other one with beautiful logic, I actually made a guide, a written guide to it. And I put a lot of work into that. I started putting a lot more work into my submitting to cracking the cryptic lately. That one actually is reasonably short and explainable. It's got a few steps of logic that are just, whoa, what was that? But all of them are obvious in retrospect and reasonably explainable. But yeah, there aren't really too many videos of people doing walkthroughs of their own extremely difficult Sudokus, which might be a good way to bring some of this logic to a broader audience, because literally a handful of people, if that, are going to find it if you just have to crack your way through it.
Yeah, that is an interesting thought.
So it seems like this is a good time to start involving the audience. I think the conversation has been great so far. I'll actually kick us off with my kind of new user question that I have. So my question is, what is a hidden skyscraper Sudoku?
Well, there's this concept in puzzles generally. Cracking the cryptic does occasionally do other logic puzzle types, but mostly goes for Sudoku, I think, just from feedback from Google's algorithms. They get more views on those videos. But often those Sudokus are mixing together rules from other puzzle types. So there's this rule set called skyscraper, where you pretend all the numbers have a height to them. That's the number on them. And you imagine if you're standing in a particular place and looking in a particular direction, how many of those skyscrapers could you see, where ones that are taller obfuscate the views of ones which are shorter behind them. And there are actually multiple types of hidden skyscraper Sudoku. The one that I'm talking about right now is one where there are arrows on the puzzle which indicate whatever in the solution, whatever number is on that position is the skyscraper number if you're looking in the direction of that arrow from that position.
I can remember a couple of skyscraper puzzles on the channel that I've done. One was by Laura Solar, actually, which was the first hidden skyscraper puzzle that nearly broke me. So if any of you are listening to Bram's explanation and thinking that sounds very hard, you're right.
Great. So if anybody has any questions about any of this stuff for Bram or for Simon, go ahead and just raise your hand. We'll pull you up. I guess another question that I have is, and I guess, Bram, this one's more for you also. When you're starting to work on a new puzzle, or you're starting to work on, planning one of these out, kind of what are you thinking? Are you building it around a particularly clever concept that you've come up with, or do you just start from nothing and just kind of build as you go? Or what's sort of the process around building one of these things from a thought perspective?
It varies, and my approach is a little bit different from what other people usually do. So what people usually do with these things is they come up with the first step, that they have a rule set that they like, often actually sometimes a combination of rule sets. There's this tension between how much freedom you have to come up with interesting logic and having rule sets that are ridiculously complicated. So I personally am a rule set minimalist. So if I do a hidden skyscraper Sudoku, generally speaking, literally that's the only rule in the entire thing is hidden skyscraper. And I usually try to have no givens in the hints to the puzzle at all. But usually the guideline to people is you figure out a beautiful piece of logic. Generally speaking, an outlier in terms of how much you could deduce indirectly from how little of clues. And then once you've put that in the puzzle, you figure out what all the implications of those clues are, and then you figure out how to add more clues to disambiguate the rest of the puzzle after that. in ways that are heavily dependent on the clues that you just put in. And it leads to this very garden path intended solution of how you go about this puzzle. It is very much like a book. That's the way Sudokus are. There are other puzzle genres that are very, very different from Sudokus. It's like jigsaws are ones which it's like running an hourglass until it's done. Other puzzle types are very much like there's one big trick to the whole thing, one huge insight. And then once you get the huge insight, you're just done right there. Sometimes some of that shows up in Sudoku where there's the break-in. There's the first, how do I get anywhere from here at all? Like when you're just starting the puzzle. And some puzzles are very much about the break-in. There's this one gigantic, huge concept right at the very beginning that's almost like engineered that you really, really have to reason about. I'm a little bit more tend to make things of that concept, where often for that, actually setting them is a huge, huge problem. There's one of mine that actually got covered on Cracking the Cryptic is an arrow Sudoku, where there's like the break-in literally involves the entire puzzle and this one huge thing you have to figure out. And it took me so long to set that, and it was like almost a fluke that I managed somehow to find a set of arrows that did what I wanted.
Yeah, and it's very hard when you have a specific break-in like that. When often, the final stages of the puzzle need something to disambiguate digits to make sure the puzzle has a unique solution. And when you add things in later in the constructing process to make sure you don't break the break-in that you've carefully constructed can be a nightmare. And, I've lost many puzzles that way, where I've been trying to set something so that the initial logic is really tight, and then I can't get the end to work without adding clues that break that initial logic.
Yeah, the most infuriating thing is when actually you do have a working break-in, but there's actually quite a bit of freedom in the details of that break-in, and then you can't seem to get the end of it to work right, and you wind up going back to the beginning and twiddling the details of the break-in to the final thing work. Oh, man. The act of setting a Sudoku involves re-solving broken versions of your puzzle over and over and over again. And a lot of why it's so laborious for me personally is I am not a very good solver of these things. And just on principle, I haven't written any software for it yet. I'm long, long overdue for writing proper software for helping set Sudoku.
There's a program called F Puzzles, which I think is very, very clever as a setting tool.
Yeah, F Puzzles is great. It's been interesting how one of the things that's been impacting Sudoku is the rule sets that are supported by F Puzzles are becoming very different.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The two big tools that people use are F Puzzles and Penpa. And Penpa is kind of a sketch tool. It doesn't tell you when things are solved properly. And in principle, you can do anything with that. And it supports all kinds of craziness, where F Puzzles is more specific in terms of what it supports, and it tells you if you've broken the puzzle or not as you're solving, and it tells you if you violated the rules of Sudoku as you're solving. It doesn't solve the puzzle for you, but if you do something egregiously wrong, it very helpfully points out that you totally screwed up right there. And it does tell you if you've solved it, and it times you as you're doing it. So obviously it's very, very nice to be able to just make a link to F Puzzles for people. And if I do some solving stuff, I'd like to write it for and get it incorporated into F Puzzles. The person who wrote it doesn't know how to do that particularly well. But I know how one would go about making a very, very good Sudoku solver and what kinds of feedback it should give to someone as they're setting, but just haven't done it yet. It kind of harkens back to stuff actually I did in high school where you use a SAT solver. You take your Sudoku and you make a SAT encoding of it and run a general purpose SAT solver on that and use that feedback. People are of mixed mind about whether this would really help you set puzzles or tend to just result in people making impossible puzzles or ones that just feel very computer set instead of human set. If you use the tool properly, it should mostly just improve your productivity as a human setter a huge amount and result in better puzzles. But it could result in these computer-generated things, which tend to feel like modern cryptography. In the world of cryptography, I'm a cryptographer in my day job. modern cryptography is very, very different from historical cryptography. That historical cryptography feels a lot like puzzles, actually. Cracking cryptics was a thing back in the day. And modern cryptography, a lot of the point is that's just impossible. You just use primitives where that can't work at all. And there's no puzzle part of this in the slightest. You just have to crunch through trying every possible, basically, password until you find the one thing. And there's no logical approach to it. And that's not what you want out of puzzles. Puzzles, you want real insight into how to do that.
Yeah, the romance has gone out of cryptography.
I think this leads in actually to another interesting question for Simon, which is when you're picking these puzzles, again, are you looking for ones that are like the hardest thing that you've found, but that feels like it could be solved? Or are you looking for things, like that you've never seen before? Kind of what goes into selecting, a puzzle or a set of puzzles?
Well, I mean, obviously, the testers are doing a lot of that work for us, but I might get asked to have a look at a puzzle. They might think, oh, this would be a good one for Mark to do, so they'll ask me to look at it. And what I'm looking for, I sort of mentioned at the beginning, I want something that's interesting and that's something that has a nice feel to the solve. So what I really don't like, a puzzle can have a magnificent break-in, for example, but then if there's a step later in the solve that basically amounts to guessing, I abhor guessing. I mean, the Sudoku word for this is bifurcation. I have no truck for it. So what I expect is that the puzzle has a nice logical flow, and even a puzzle that had a couple of very nice steps in it, if it at any point revolved around sort of guess logic, it's not a good enough puzzle for me, and I wouldn't really want to see it on the channel.
So there needs to be a way to solve it. Just difficulty straight up isn't attractive, even if it's possible to solve it. It's about, finding kind of as Bram said earlier, like the path through it, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the most common questions we get asked on cracking a cryptic is, can we solve, there's quite a famous Sudoku that got a lot of press coverage that has only 17 given digits. And, can we solve that on the channel, we get asked. Well, the thing about that puzzle is, it has absolutely no logical beauty from a human being's perspective. It's just one immense bifurcation. You basically have to guess a digit, do about 300 steps and find whether that digit is correct or not. And then you guess the next digit and, you go about 300 steps and you find that fails. And you have to do that over and over again about 1,000 times. Well, that's not very interesting. And, it's as far from where I want cracking the cryptic to be as can be imagined. So yeah, very much not into puzzles that just require brute force or, a sort of computer approach to solving a puzzle.
It can sometimes mean you're done setting a puzzle and you actually have to make it easier.
Yeah, that must be true, yeah.
Often you'll have a puzzle where you got through the break-in and actually the puzzle's pretty much disambiguated at that point, that if a computer does an exhaustive search, it will tell you you're down to a unique solution, but there's just no elegant human way of figuring that out, and new clues needed to be added for the humans to solve the thing.
So on that point, we're in an era where sort of narrow AI is increasingly becoming useful. I've been playing around with it a lot in sort of like the generative text areas and a variety of other areas. And, where we are today versus where we were, say, 3 years ago is really pretty substantial. I wonder if narrow AI has any impact on the sort of Sudoku or puzzle world generally. Is there a potential that perhaps the ones that are more human solvable wind up getting devalued if people start running software? Or is that just sort of not the point, to the point where people who are interested in these types of problems aren't going to deploy it in that way?
So solving Sudokus is a sport. It's in the general field of mind sports. And since time immemorial, we've had ways to use devices to lift and move heavy objects and things like that. That hasn't stopped there from being sports of humans, seeing how big and heavy of objects we can lift and move. If you were to try and have online puzzle solving competitions, then you have questions of how do you keep the humans from cheating, because it's much, much easier to cheat at these things than it is to cheat at in-person events where people are lifting and moving things, right? But the fact that a computer can do it better than a human doesn't detract from the achievement or the enjoyment of the human doing it just for their own sake. The relationship to AI is interesting. Back when I actually was in high school and did stuff related to AI, or what was called AI at the time. Back then, we were working on SAT solvers, But in some sense, among hard-ish problems that are called NP complete, they can all be translated into each other. That's the whole point of NP completeness. So there's this standard encoding that's very natural for doing this called SAT. And it turns out, so we were working on SAT solvers just for their own sake, because that seemed like an important and good thing to work on. And what happened later, what really shocked everyone, was for the most part, when you run into problems in industry and stuff that are NP complete, it's almost never a good idea to write a custom solver for that one thing. You're wasting your time. What you should do is write something that makes a SAT encoding of the problem that you have at hand and run a general purpose SAT solver on that. Because that general purpose SAT solver running on a SAT encoding that you wrote of the thing, having no idea whatsoever of what the actual problem it's looking at actually is, will just obliterate your custom written solver in terms of performance, just destroy it, like always, every time. And that really, really shocked everyone, including us people who were actually working on SAT solvers, but most definitely has proven to be the case. And advancements in AI for a long time, now these got fired from being part of AI, because the tradition was as soon as something gets somewhere, it stops being called artificial intelligence. But for a very, very long time, the field of artificial intelligence in terms of its ability to solve things has been all about this kind of approach. And when people make advancements in it, they're viewing it really as a search problem, like how efficiently can I do this, what you call bifurcation in Sudoku? How well can I do bifurcation? And then there's more recent advancements in AI that are really amazing, that are about, there's still no insight, right? Like what we think of when we imagine romantically artificial intelligence, we imagine insight and understanding. The AI we have today still doesn't have insight and understanding, but it has recognition. So it's moved on from search to recognition. But a way this does sort of interestingly relate to Sudoku is there's this like very short list of reasoning techniques that you can never really use. And one of them has to do with just doing inequalities, what in Sudoku world is generally represented with a killer Sudoku, which there's a lot of killer Sudoku with really, really interesting logic in it. And for those, you have to like do sums and things. And the general idea as well, if the sum of these things has to be at least this amount, then we can deduce certain things from that. And those can be a little awkward to represent in SAT, and you would think that the SAT solvers would be at a disadvantage with those kinds of things in there, and things that like know those inequalities, that actually know inequalities natively can use them better, but in practice, not so much. But usually this stuff doesn't show up for practical Sudokus you'd actually solve, just because they're so small that computers can just tromp through them. Our little human brains just can't really do all that much.
I think one of the things that's quite interesting is if you look at the world of chess at the moment, I mean, although the best chess player or just the computers basically have the highest rating now, and the human beings can't compete anymore with the power of the microchip, it's still incredibly entertaining to watch Magnus Carlsen play chess, even though the computer might be able to play better moves. And I think it's a little bit like that with Sudoku.
So one of the things that I was wondering is, again, like computers can create these puzzles. Can computers also solve these puzzles as efficiently? Is there a difference between, certainly it seems like for a human, it's more challenging to set one of these than it is to complete, I think in theory, based on what I'm hearing from this conversation. So does something like that exist on sort of the computer side too? Do computers solve these?
It's a really interesting question. I think I'm right in saying that almost all of the puzzles that we feature on Cracking the Cryptic wouldn't be solved by a computer. If you were to type them into the best computer solvers out there, the computer wouldn't be able to do them, because the computerization of the solving techniques has not caught up yet with what humans are doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of asterisks.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in terms of could the computer prove that that puzzle had one solution? Yes, but could it show you how to find that solution logically? No, not really, or not in a way that would be intelligible to a human.
Yeah, for classic Sudoku, people have really put these Herculean efforts into making like pretty much an exhaustive list of all the possible reasoning techniques that can be used on classic Sudoku. And for a given Sudoku, it will apply all of these and see how far it can get to really give you a human understandable notion of the path through the solving process of the puzzle. When you start adding in other rules and limitations to the thing, this is not an exhaustible list of what are the reasoning techniques that a human can understand that are vaguely plausibly spottable that could be in a puzzle at all. And a lot of what setters do is really go out of their way to find interesting edge cases of this, to figure out like things that can be understood by a human and spotted by a human, but are very novel and strange and surprising that you wouldn't normally see in things. And yeah, so no one's done a particularly great job of making something that will do that for generalized Sudoku. The F puzzles really has gone through a Herculean effort to make a good stab at it, but especially puzzles on cracking the cryptic really go out of their way to make that not work as part of the point of the whole exercise. And if you wanted to make something that would really do that well in general, it would have to be something which doesn't try to explicitly enumerate, okay, here's the list of reasoning techniques, but has a more generalized concept of what kinds of reasoning there could be, and then figuring out how to use that. And even within those, it's kind of interesting to go, okay, well, what are the really, really obscure things you could use? So there are things that use like modular arithmetic. Fistemifel said that there's a particular puzzle that he thinks is the most beautiful break-in that he's ever made that was covered on the Cracking the Cryptic, and that involves modular arithmetic, which is really, really obscure. I've never seen that done outside of Mod 2, which is called parity in puzzles in general. So that's like a really interesting and notable thing to have happen in a puzzle. And I think it's almost like a bit of a game that the better you make the computer solver at spotting human understandable things, the more it's going to become a game of what is there that humans can understand that this is missing still, that we can try and mess with it.
Okay, so let me take this a little bit further down the rabbit hole then, right? So we focus a lot on kind of the world of cryptocurrency. Bram, you recently launched Chia to mainnet with a new type of, I believe, proof of space and time, which is sort of a new spin on proof of work. Proof of work, people often kind of describe intuitively as computers solving problems as a way to then compare themselves against other participants in the network, you know, in a proof of work Bitcoin type situation, to then get the privilege of creating a block and getting the reward for that. People have tried to create systems that were not scalable by the number of processors, were not scalable by the number of, you know, various devices. You've gone with something that's scalable by the amount of sort of hard drive space that you can allocate to your protocol. Is there a potential connection here to something like Sudoku, puzzles that can be verified by, you know, a protocol, but which might have to be solved by humans? Like, could a Sudoku-powered consensus mechanism that would actually gate against sort of procedural stuff and make it so that humans actually had to do that work, but also couldn't be sort of replaced by computers? Do you think something like that's possible and a good idea, or do you think that it just would lead to sort of an arms race in the technology that would then make it so we have very good, computers that can solve this stuff very well?
Oh, if only. It would be so nice to have that, right? Like, it would be really, really nice to have a global cryptocurrency that was powered by CAPTCHAs, that the poor people of the world could sit around helping secure this thing by solving CAPTCHAs, but maybe more interesting than regular CAPTCHAs that we have, and be doing this very productive work of securing the world's finances just using their built-in human cognitive power that we couldn't replace with current computers. That unfortunately can't be done.
Okay. What's the problem?
There's a whole long list of problems that have to do with this difference between modern and, I'm not sure the right word, but historical cryptography that we were talking about before. That modern cryptography, you want to be bad puzzles. You specifically need certain properties out of it where all you're doing is grinding, and you're grinding just a huge amount and doing both an amount of computation that's beyond what we humans can do just in terms of raw output. Our throughput for, the arithmetic computation is extremely poor. But even outside of that, it's designed to not have insights into how to do things. It's specifically made so that, when you have a solution, it's an anomaly. There's no approximate solutions anywhere near it, and that there's no economies of scale of any kind, that having a larger group of resources working on something gets exactly linear on the amount of resource it is, and it's not getting any economy of scale. And a lot of things that are really like the opposite of having any insight to something whatsoever, and a whole lot of things that we humans are very bad at doing. So that's not to say that you can't try to improve on consensus algorithms and their bottlenecks to make them be better in terms of what it goes for. I think proof of space and time that I've come up with is an itty bitty tiny little step in that direction of this like utopia that you would love to have. And it is merely a tiny little step, but has this benefit that it actually can be built. So we stick with what we got.
That makes sense. Thanks for going down that rabbit hole with me.
Actually, it's funny. In Chia, we do use the term puzzle in a place. That you have a coin, which in order to spend it, it has a puzzle that needs to have a solution that's provided, which will successfully spend the coin. And we use these terms instead of the Bitcoin terms, which are script pubkey and script sig, which are much less poetic terms, but are technically speaking more accurate because these are puzzles in the modern cryptography sense, that they're not interesting puzzles to solve. They are very, very difficult. You simply crunch through to solve them things. Oh, hey, Simon, I wanted to ask actually about other logic puzzle types. Your channel has gotten very, very focused on Sudoku specifically, and there are other types that I think are great kinds of puzzles that seem to not fit the format at all, although there are others that you seem to like using. Is that, well, two questions. One, of the logic puzzles that have this sort of garden path to finding the solution, why is Sudoku so dominant among those? And the other is, why not cover occasionally a puzzle which is literally just like you mess with it until you find this like one thing that snaps into place. Like a puzzle type I got obsessed with at one point is puzzles where you cut a region into a bunch of identical shapes.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And those, you know, you do the breakthrough and you're done. But I'm not sure how well that would work for a solve video.
That's a good question. I'm not sure either. What we've experienced, I mean, my starting position is that I would love to show more logic puzzles on the channel. You know, I'm a massive fan of the whole sort of Japanese pencil puzzle genre, and that includes so many different kinds of, you know, beautiful problems, whether it's Nurikabe or Heiwaki or even Hitori and things like that. But there's loads of them. And our experience has been when we've showcased puzzles of those types, often people sort of say, yeah, this was nice for a change, but where's the Sudoku? Which is, I mean, it's a little bit frustrating in a way. So what I'm now saying to constructors and testers is, you know, if you come across exceptional examples of, you know, the pencil puzzle genre, please do send them to us. And, you know, I will try and cover them just to show these puzzles in their very best light and to try and see if we can, you know, ignite an interest that should exist in those sorts of puzzles, but for some reason doesn't. And, you know, it's a good question, why doesn't it? I think it basically is because the Sudoku rule set is so simple. You know, it really is, you know, you can understand it probably as a 4 or 5 year old child could understand the rules of Sudoku. Whereas some of the Japanese pencil puzzles where it might say, well, you know, 2x2 area can be one color or something, it starts to get a bit esoteric a little bit quickly. And maybe that's a barrier to entry. But, you know, I'd love to see more puzzles like that on the channel. And some of the favourite videos I've ever made on the channel have been other genres altogether. You know, great examples from puzzle hunts, online puzzle hunts. I remember we did that incredible word search about Canadian prime ministers that ended up being all about Graham's number. I mean, it was just a staggering creation. And, of course, the puzzle that I still view as the hardest puzzle I've ever seen, which was Adventure, which featured in the Galactic Puzzle Hunt about 2 or 3 years ago by John Snyder. And that puzzle has to be seen to be believed. I mean, it starts off as like a text adventure, you know, where literally one of those old classic text adventures where you have to type in W to go west and north to go north. And you end up, you know, visiting a load of rooms in a place that are full of monkeys that talk to you about what's on the floor. And the complexity of that puzzle, I'm sure, is something that would appeal to you as a programmer, Bram, because it ends up being almost a programming problem. But for someone like me who's not a programmer, to have to think through the logic that was required to solve that puzzle was quite extraordinary. I mean,
actually, when people try and make programming-based things, they tend to fail at that. Yeah, a rare thing that really nails it, there's a game called Human Resource Machine that I had.
I love it. Yeah, I love it.
That one is real programming and really a lot of fun. But I actually tend to be like pretty hyper minimalist about rule sets on things. Like one thing that I succeeded in coming up with this year, another concept that took me forever to design, the question of can you make an interesting puzzle, which is just an object where the puzzle is to find what the symmetry of the object is. And I came up with one of these that's a super simple thing that's really quite beautiful and I think very infuriating to people because it doesn't seem like it should be at all difficult for this. Having this setup where you can have like a new puzzle every day that's both in line with what is expected, but yet still is new and interesting in some way is really a huge achievement. We've had it with crosswords for decades now. Those are very, very well established. I unfortunately am utterly hopeless at crosswords, but for a long time, there were enough interesting logic problems that you could put out like a daily logic problem if you wanted to, but each one of them is like a different thing and not super thematic, and people couldn't have like as part of their daily routine, they just go through and do the daily logic problem like people do for daily crosswords. Where doing Sudoku, classic Sudoku, I think isn't quite there because it does wind up being like kind of the same thing every day after a while. Where like Sudoku with these variants really does seem to nail it. You can just keep making more of those until the end of time.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think the sort of Western newspaper editors have a lot to answer for, what they've done to classic Sudoku. Because I'm sure you've done like puzzles by Niccoli and, the classic Sudokus by Niccoli are always a pleasure to solve. And, if you have a few minutes and you just want something to exercise your brain, they're a lot of fun. They're really clever. And they always have an idea behind them. And, the Western Sudoku audience, unless you watch something like Cracking the Cryptic, has never actually experienced Sudoku of that form. All they've experienced is the stuff churned out by Wayne Gould's computer algorithm, which, it's a form of puzzle for sure, but it's not showing Sudoku, in my opinion, in its best light. And I suppose I should be grateful for that because that means that there's a gap for Cracking the Cryptic. But I'd love to see a newspaper editor or a puzzle editor at a newspaper take the risk and say, well, actually, look, I'm going to make my puzzle section stand out because I'm going to include handcrafted puzzles. And yes, I may have to pay very slightly more than I have to pay for the, the computer program that generates 10 million puzzles, that are all of a very modest quality. But I think that as a result, I'll actually gain a bit of a following in terms of puzzle solvers wanting to buy my newspaper or to subscribe to my puzzle site. I think it's a shame that hasn't happened, and I think it will do one day.
Yeah, I think you're doing it with
maybe.
Puzzles that actually get solved on Cracking the Cryptic are like Schelling points that, like, if you're discussing puzzles with other people who are into these things, these are things that most of the time they'll be familiar with specific ones if you bring them up in discussion. And this is a common point of discussion to be had. And there's value to that, of having that like curation thing and this common understanding of here's a set of puzzles we should all sort of know about. But definitely you're right about the newspaper editors not doing a good job. I don't think running a daily classic Sudoku until the end of time is really such a great idea. But even when the New York Times has like done Sudoku variants, they really haven't done a great job of it. Thomas Schneider at one point was doing basically a diss track where he was doing, New York Times was publishing puzzles that were different types of logic puzzles. And he was daily posting just handcrafted ones that he'd made with the exact same rule set every day that were much, much more interesting.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
So clearly there's a complete excess of talent who are willing to make these. It's kind of funny. A lot of the puzzles that you get that you can, buy mechanical ones of and stuff, the set of challenges that come with those. People were often paid to make those, but the people who made those are like Wei Wop Wang and Bob Hearn and people who are ludicrously, insanely overqualified in terms of how much they get paid at their day jobs for doing this sort of thing. It really is like very much this open source thing. There's this like small army of people who are directly and indirectly like contributing just to cracking the cryptic, without whom it wouldn't be nearly as good as it is. And if you were to actually have to budget and pay people to do that work, it would just, the cost would be insane.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting trying to do this for a living. But on the other hand, it's an awful lot more fun than what I was doing before. So I'll take the reduction in the salary and be grateful, to be honest.
Yeah, congratulations on the success so far, and hopefully the explosive growth continues. It's really been amazing.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. Yeah, that's the puzzle we haven't cracked, is the YouTube algorithm. You should cover the algorithm on one of these podcasts, and I will be a devoted listener.
Oh, that's another thing that's intentionally a black box. Google is trying hard to make it so that their algorithms reward just good content. And so there's a question of what is good content. I think Sudoku content is great content. And yeah, but still clickbaity things sometimes work a bit. Like, to what extent does a clickbaity headline actually tell you what's going on and get people interested in something that for good reasons? And to what extent is it a gimmicky trick? That might be a bit of an existential question that Google is trying to work out.
Yeah, I think that's right. And occasionally, or obviously, we've tried clickbaity titles. But when we've done clickbaity titles, we've tried to do them actually so that a discerning viewer of the video would go at the end of it, actually, although I was clickbaited, it was true what was in the title. So, it's not like one of these, things that say, oh, only 5% of people can solve this genius problem or something. If we say it, it's probably true. But yeah, it doesn't seem to make any difference.
Yeah, there was one of mine, the headline was no given digits in this one, which was true. That was back when that was unusual.
Yeah.
I'm hoping at some point that there's like some kind of in-person convention of Sudoku people centered around cracking the cryptic type stuff that happens. There can't be during lockdown, but it seems like there's enough of a community to do it.
I think that's right. And I was speaking to somebody the other day about the World Sudoku Championship, and as and when that happens again, it would be very nice to go there, even if it's not as a competitor, but just to be there amongst fellow enthusiasts. And I think it's good. I think that we are slowly building a tribe of people who really love these sorts of puzzles, and it would be great to meet in person and, celebrate it.
Thanks to Simon for being a guest on this episode. This was actually the first podcast Simon had ever done. It was recorded a while ago. Links to the things mentioned are in the show notes.